I'd like to express my gratitude to all participants of this Trilateral Party Seminar, hosted by KEI, KF-VUB Korea Chair, George Washington Institute for Korean Studies, and KIEP. I am very pleased that we are gathered here with experts to examine the emerging trade issues and discuss trade cooperation among the European Union, Korea, and the United States. How can I define the contemporary world? Probably uncertainty, hyper uncertainty, is one of the words that figure out the world. There will be no exception with respect to global trade as well. We are facing new issues, including digital trade, trade related to climate change, and economic security issue. De-globalization, protectionism, strategic competition between the United States and China, and of course the pandemic have worsened the situation. We are now in the age of distrust that many countries and companies are seeking to reorganize their supply chain. Distrust is causing governments to pursue economic security to build more stable relations with their allies. Moreover, incidents such as the Ukraine and Russian war and more frequent natural disasters are also affecting global supply chains. That the importance of economic security is emphasized more than ever throughout this century. We are facing the age of great transformation too. There are two main transformation challenges that we need to tackle. Digital transformation and green transformation. Advancement of technology is leading at the world forum from analog to digital. Digital transformation is changing our lives in many ways. The many efforts are made to stipulate digital in various ways, including global trade. So digital trade is one of main agenda for global discussion in trade, that global norms on digital trade are being discussed through multilateral, plurilateral, and bilateral channels, including WTO e-commerce panel, US-China, US-Japan digital trade agreement, and the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, so-called DEPA, and then IPEP. Korea participates in these global rule-setting discussions and build the foundation for the growth of the domestic digital industries. Climate crisis is another challenge that we need to overcome with green transformation. Many countries declare to take action to achieve the carbon neutrality since Paris Agreement in 2015. But it is true that countries found difficulties in making green transformation, but now stronger global consensus is built to achieve eco-friendly society. The more aggressive movements are made in many countries. In particular, European Union's announcement of the carbon border adjustment mechanism in July of last year was a major instant for its trading partners to realize the necessity of green transformation. Such a system may bring a dramatic change of conventional business strategy of the EU's trading partners, including Korea, who has many global leading firms in carbon-intensive industries. In this ever-changing trade environment, we need to review our positions on each of these new trade issues and develop creative and efficient policies to respond to these issues. We need to go beyond the traditional trade policies such as FTAs and develop policies suitable to address these new global trade issues. Therefore, we have a lot of work to do. Ladies and gentlemen, it's very meaningful that we are gathered here to share our insights on such key issues like the digital technology, economic security, and environment, while global trade paradigm are shifting rapidly. As we have renowned experts here at the seminar, I'm very much looking forward to fruitful discussion to figure out our ways forward in this changing environment. Once again, I'd like to express my gratitude for your participation. Thank you. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
Thank you, President Kim. 감사합니다. Our next speaker is Ramon Pacheco Pardo, KF-VUB Korea Chair at the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy of the Brussels School of Governance.
Yes, thank you very much. In the interest of time, I will be very brief. I just want to say that I'm very pleased on behalf of our Korea Chair to be able to partner with KIEP, K and the Korean Studies Institute at the George Washington University. And we look forward to a very fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ramon. That was really great. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm sure you have a very long, speech prepared, but because of this technical glitch, you can post your speech on the KIEP website later. Last but not least, our next speaker is Ambassador Kathleen Stevens, President and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute of America.
Thank you, Young-ho, and good morning, good evening, everyone. Your technical glitch allowed me to run through the rain here. There's a demonstration going on at the IMF, so things are back to normal in some ways. And I'll try to make my remarks short too, but I do want to say a great thank you to our host and partner here at GW, Institute of Korean Studies. Thank you to the Dean, to our other partners, President Kim at KIEP, the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, and of course, Dr. Kim Hoon-chung in his own right is one of Korea's leading Europeanists, and of course, the Korea Foundation for University of Brussels Korea Chair. I'd say hello to people I haven't seen before, like Ramon, and thanks, congratulations on your book and a great title, Shrimp to Whale, by the way, those are something like that. We're here today to deepen our discussion of the relationship between the Republic of Korea, the United States, and the European Union, and particularly look at the areas of commerce, trade, and economy, or to use, I guess, one of the catchphrase words of the moment, economic security, that are in such flux right now. And the question is not why are we doing this? I think it's self-evident why this is important, but why haven't we done more of this before? But I'm glad we're doing it now. My own experience as a former diplomat who spent half of her career, my career, working on Asia and half working on Europe, is that at least at that time in the United States, we tended to kind of view trans-Pacific and transatlantic relations from the US point of view as kind of separate and distinct spheres. But while I was in Korea as ambassador about a decade ago, I was certainly reminded, remember this minister, I was reminded how even then that was an incomplete way of looking at things. And when it came to free trade agreements, of course, the US had negotiated one painstakingly with Korea over a number of years. And then kind of in 2011, it seemed like kind of at the last moment, the EU swooped in and negotiated a free trade agreement and then ratified it and implemented it even before we'd gotten ours done. So, so much for the slowness of EU bureaucracy and politics. But it was a spur to the United States, I think, to understand that we're all in this together. And of course, a decade later, we know that more than ever. We have a different set of issues, though, a different and far more complex context, resilient supply chains, climate change policy, export controls, digital security, all areas in which each of our spheres play such an important role. The agenda has expanded, as our agenda today shows, beyond trade, as we defined it a decade ago. And while we're calling for cooperation among like-minded democracies, there also, of course, is a lot of potential for conflict, disagreement, disruption. So my final point here is, using some of Ramon's time, is economically, maybe it's time to think of ourselves as in a three superpower world. Economically, the US, China, and the US are all roughly the same size, and together make up about half of the world's GDP. And of course, Korea's relationship with all three matters to itself and to the world. And geographically, I think it's important for we Americans to remember that Seoul is closer to Brussels than to Washington, at least geographically. Successive South Korean governments have sought to deepen their ties, economic and strategic, with Europe. And this has deepened and continued with the Yoon administration, which has also prioritized strengthening the US-Korea alliance. So I'm looking forward to the conference today. Welcome, and thank you to our speakers, especially those who have traveled so far. I think that today will be an important step in deepening our understanding of our respective perspectives and identifying the areas that need active attention and management. And with this, some potential cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Stevens. My goal today was to turn it over to the moderator of the first session, no later than 10 a.m. in Washington time, and I think I will be successful. So let me turn it over to Nick Bernatus, who will moderate the first session.
Maybe we call everybody. You want
Speakers, please have seat at the table.
Yeah. One is on there. It's my privilege today and humbling experience actually to sit at the table with such distinguished guests. One, of course, is joining us online. So we have three distinguished guests, and I think I will introduce them one by one shortly, if possible, so because I want to hear, I'm eager to hear their statements. So I will start with Dr. Techel Park. Just go alphabetically. He is the president of the Global Commerce Institute of Lee and Co. Currently, but in this audience, I think he's also a professor at the Graduate School of International Studies in Seoul National. But to us, he's well known as a Minister of Trade a few years back. And also the representative of Korea who ran for the leadership of the World Trade Organization in 2013, I believe. So I don't, without further ado, I want to ask Professor Park to give us his opening remarks, if you have any. Into the discussion. All right, I am pretty happy about this. So let me then continue with Professor Michael Reiter. Michael is our representative on this panel from Europe. He has had an amazing career as well, both in academia, but also in government. His native country is Austria. A very important European Union member. So he has had a political career in Austria, but also a political career in the EU. Reading through the short bio sketch that we have on this list, he is a distinguished professor at the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy, which is at the Brussels School of Governance, and he is the editor of the policy brief series of that school. So as I said, he has served in many positions in the EU and in Austria, and several of them have to do with East Asia. So he is very well qualified to talk about the topic of this first panel. And finally, let me close with our third panelist, who is online, who is joining us online. And I understand that the reason he's joining us online is because he is a very conscientious professor, like the rest of us, and he has to teach a class shortly in Harvard. So this is Robert Zelnick. Obviously, in the United States, there's hardly anyone in this town who has not heard his name and does not know who he is. He's currently a senior counselor at the Brunswick Group Geopolitical. He's also an adjunct professor and senior fellow at the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard. If you go through his bio sketch, you will understand my question is, how can one person do all these things in one lifetime? I don't know. But he was president of the organization next door here, the World Bank, for several years. He was a U.S. trade representative for a number of years. He has served in many different positions in the U.S. government, White House, and whatnot, and has received number. Please read the second paragraph in his bio sketch. A number of medals and very important distinctions around the world from various countries around the world. So he is certainly qualified to talk about the subject today. I don't know if before we go into the discussion, if Michael has an opening statement. Do you have, Michael?
At least if you ask the former ambassador to say something, he might say something, but we can go into the discussion, I think.
Okay, all right. Robert?
I'm sorry I can't be with you personally, but as you said, I'm teaching a class at Harvard and I've got both Korean and European students, so glad to be with you.
All right, very good. So I would let me sit then also next. I would go directly into Q&A then, because there is very little else to say. Everybody is waiting. So here is a question. The question is, as we heard before, that the world is being reorganized now. There is serious problems with fragility of global value chains. It's not a new issue. We all knew this. Actually, in this school, I teach classes. We have been talking about this since the Obama administration, that the global value chains are not exactly set up very appropriately. They are set up only on the basis of economic considerations and not necessarily other considerations that affect economics and geopolitical issues. Nevertheless, the COVID made this obvious, and thus currently we are in a major reorganization. Now, the question is the following. We have global value chains. We have an organization of the international economic system. We are sort of in the process of reorganizing it extensively. Now, there will be costs to this. If you ask an economist like me, I will tell you there will be very serious economic costs to this. This is not going to be easy. Everybody, there will be costs for everybody. So the question is how actually to react to this as people who understand the international system. What's the correct way, the better way, not the optimum way. I'm not saying the optimum, but the better way to react to these changes internationally. Let's start from this. Yes.
Well, I didn't say any opening remarks, but I will say two sentences.
Great.
Thank you, Professor Bonotas. I will thank conference organizers for inviting me to this important gathering. I also like to thank you for serving the moderator in this session. I specifically more particularly thank Ambassador Catherine Stevens who organized, all kind of thing along with Mr. Kim and so. Well, let me directly answer your question. First question. My answer is based on my individual expertise, representing Korea, but it's my personal view. And there seem to be three main causes for the recent supply chain restructuring issues. First, as you mentioned, COVID-19 pandemic and the war between Russia and Ukraine. The second, the US measures based on the national security concerns. The third, politically motivated nationalism, which emphasizes domestic production more than trade, and they emphasize reshoring more than globalization. All of this may disrupt supply chain and distort trade and foreign direct investment. So Korean firms, I don't know exactly how they are reacting, but I heard many of them are diversifying their supply sources for core materials, parts, and components obviously it will cost, increase the cost of doing business because of this kind of reaction. And also some firms even consider a strategy of establishing vertical integration of the supply chain. At the same time, Korean government will evaluate unilateral measures based on the national security concerns to see if they violate the rules of WTO. At the same time, Korean government will faithfully implement the RCEP agreement. We joined the RCEP a couple of years ago, and also try to accede to the CPTPP to secure more stable supply chain opportunities within the region. Regarding politically motivated protectionist measures, we should consider, I think this is a very important topic to discuss more, but I just simply say that, we should consider establishing inclusive trade policies to help workers, industries, and small and medium-sized enterprises that may have suffered from globalization and trade. I will just stop here.
Thank you very much. Michael.
Well, thank you. I think there is nothing to add to the analysis of some of the reasons, but I would just add that when we think back a little bit, that the idea of strategic autonomy, reshoring, friendshoring, and so on has already started before the pandemic, and it has, so it's not as new as we sometimes are made to believe. Because we have seen, I would say, from 2016 onwards, a stronger intervention of governments into the economy, encouraging the domestic industries and impeding cross-border goods and capital flows. The definition of nationally sensitive industry and technologies, limits on foreign direct investment, these were all issues which we have seen in 2016. Then we had the add-on of the pandemic. The pandemic changed our perception fundamentally, because suddenly we made the experience that high-tech products like the mask you're wearing became a strategic good. And I think that added to the idea of reshoring. So I think that each and every government has an obligation to make sure that its population is prepared for pandemic, is prepared for economic shocks, and measures have to be taken. And I think there is now the crucial point. We have seen it also in the European Union when the pandemic started. We had the reflex in member states. We have to do it alone. And unfortunately, that took only about less than a month. And then there was cooperation, there was collective buying, purchasing, negotiation, also to make sure that there was a development of vaccines. Then there was the next tremendous step by the European Union in having Euro bonds in order to finance the costs of re-establishing the economy. Well, I think we were on a good path, and then we had the war in Ukraine. And that is enormous costs are coming on us. And because of the war, we have now the add-on of energy prices, and they have to be financed. And that comes also to your question. Governments can cushion the effects to a certain degree, but at one moment, companies and also private households will have to put a higher bill of energy. And we will see that very soon. And one has to prepare people for that. But on the other hand, and this is the international dimension, if I look now at the differential of energy prices between the European Union and the US and Asian countries, if there's a differential of 1 to 5 to 1 to 7, well, that has a very strong economic impact. That has an impact on competition. And I think there is now the element where the strategic cooperation with friends and allies has to come in. So shoring to make sure that there is an access to energy has become not only important strategically, but it has also a very strong economic competition element. And I think that's also necessary that we talk about these issues, because it will be very difficult to explain to the electorate in Europe, wherever they are. We have to shoulder basically alone the higher costs of energy. I think this is an important issue, and this is where geopolitics meets geoeconomics in a very strong manner. So I think that's something I would like to put a flag. The second issue I would like to flag is, of course, and when you take measure to restart or to support an economy, one should be as conscious as possible, and I'm very carefully formulating that, not to discriminate. And discrimination in favor of national champions, I have mentioned that at the beginning, is of course a danger. And if you choose national champions, which are important perhaps for the transition to a green economy, then I think we have a problem. And we also have a problem amongst allies and friends if there is not enough consultation. I think that's the second issue to flag. And perhaps the third issue, and that links us a little bit. I was negotiating in the World Trade Organization. I spent 5 years of my public life in trying to set up the World Trade Organization. And therefore, I'm a little bit personally biased, but I think we need a functioning international trading system. And I think there we have now talking between the EU and Korea. In Korea, a strong partner. There is an interest, and you were a living interest in that. But we have a World Trade Organization which is dysfunctional. And there is the appellate body, which was brought to death, as there is no nomination of judges, basically. And we have seen a change of administration, but we have not really seen a strong change of attitude when it comes to the WTO. And I think this is something which we should take up, because working on this framework of international trade rules, this is certainly something Korea, US, and EU can do together, because we have an interest in a stable environment, trade environment, even if we are economic competitors. And I think this is something which unites us, and where all the talk about common interests, common values should be translated as quickly as possible into concrete actions to get the WTO back on track, because otherwise we will have minilateral, plurilateral, bilateral arrangements, which at the end of the day are to the detriment of the multilateral trading system. And one of the key functions of the WTO is also to protect the weaker ones. So I'm not in favor, to say it also clearly, in concluding all kinds of framework agreements. The framework agreement avoids an FTA, and if you have an FTA, you have Article 24 of GATT, and then you can control it. And if you have framework agreements below that level, maybe there are good domestic reasons for that, but talking internationally, it is not good. And they also lack normally one strong element, which is market access. So if we want to get the ball rolling again, I think this is what we have to do as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Michael. I understand that global governance is a key issue here, and I could not agree more, because as an economist, every economist actually from day one understands that the basic, the underlying situation for every market to function well is good property rights. If we know, if it is very well known by all the players what the rules are, then things work well. Otherwise, not. Okay, let's turn to Robert. Robert, please.
So just to complement the two good opening remarks, when asked to participate in this, I wanted to agree because I think the trilateral relationship with Korea and the European Union is very important. Having said that, in some ways, you couldn't have asked for better timing of this conference, given some of the recent announcements of US policy. And so to start, Nicholas, with one of your observations, I'm often asked whether globalization is in retreat. And I draw a distinction between the phenomenon of globalization and the governance of globalization. On the phenomenon, if you look around and you think about climate or pandemics or energy and food prices or interest rates and monetary policies and debt, it's a little hard to come to the conclusion that globalization doesn't remain quite vibrant and active. However, the governance is fraying and fragmenting, and particularly as Michael's sort of last remarks of that nature. I think it's of course understandable, and Minister Vark mentioned this, in the aftermath of lessons of COVID and some of the Chinese controls of exports, that businesses would want to try to build resilience, have alternative sources, flexible means to cushion disruption, and that this is a combination of both business and government policy. But I think in recent year, actually, you've seen a major development on the US front. And it gives me no comfort to say this. I don't actually agree with a lot of these policies, but they're a reality, which is, I think, that while Korea in its development history has had an industrial policy, the US industrial policy was perhaps a more fluid process. But if you look in the recent legislation dealing with electronic vehicles, batteries, semiconductors, the United States has really now moved quite actively to the nature of a much more directed industrial policy. This has huge implications for Korea, given the nature of the Korean economy. Korea is actually in the forefront of a number of these technologies. And so it will be affected, as we can talk about during the day, with the particular rules on electronic vehicles or the announcements yesterday about semiconductors. And I think one has to recognize that this comes back significantly to the US policy on China. And one saw the reports yesterday of the US national security strategy, but the United States is headed for an economic confrontation with China. And that will involve both Korea and the European Union. So by way of opening comments, I will just say that I think it is critically important for both partners, both of whom are strong allies, have long-standing relations with the United States, to try to shape the nature of these policies. As you could see, we could talk about this more in the case of electronic vehicles. The policy even changed in the United States from the initial proposals that the Biden administration had in the Build Back Better Act to the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, in some ways, they didn't alleviate some of the concerns of South Korean auto companies. They're probably okay for South Korean battery companies. But I simply use this as an example of the fact that that's a different dynamic than US policy had even 5 or 10 years ago. President Trump introduced a much more transactional nature to trade. I wasn't sympathetic with that approach either. But what you're now seeing the United States moving towards in the technology area is a much more directed policy. And frankly, like others on the panel, I'm concerned about the international effects of this. But as a reality, it will proceed. And it's all the more important then to have the type of engagement in some detail with our close allies and partners, certainly including the European Union and South Korea, so people understand the full implications of this. The last observation I'll make on this is that this, of course, will bear costs. Interdependence hasn't gone away. We're just adding frictions to the system. But as a policy matter, I think this will be the new reality.
Very good. Thank you, Robert. In fact, we have one question that is directly linked to this, and it's from Dr. KIEP. Let me read it. There have been many opinions about the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, from opinion leaders and the public in Korea. I would like to hear evaluations on IRA from the American side and the European side. That's what's on my side. Who wants to start? We can go, Michael. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not talking on the US behalf.
No.
No, I think the position and the feeling in Europe is quite clear and straightforward. That these measures discriminate against EU producers in favor of US-based producers. It is clear that this is not a measure which contributes to the reduction of greenhouse gases. It is not a measure which is in line with the necessary transition we are working on. I'm sure my colleagues would have been more happy if there had been, first of all, no discriminatory element. Secondly, if there had been consultation about that issue. And fundamentally, also from the economic point of view, I think there is the prevailing view that these are measures which are not cost effective. They are not to increase the efficiency of production methods at all, because it is actually protectionist measures. And one of the convictions is that there is actually no protection in protectionism. And I think this is something which one should learn. I remember when I was still ambassador in Korea and there was the renegotiation of the chorus, there was attached a protocol which allowed the import of US cars which did not fulfill the environmental standards of Korea. So I think if we have an all-in government approach, then also those who are in charge of environmental protection or are in charge of fighting climate change should also be part of that decision-making process. It should not be that one side of the government is saying A and the other side of the government is saying B. I think this is also a very big political challenge because we tend now to downplay the importance of all the measures which should be taken for climate change. We had the first layer was COVID. Okay, now we have to take care of COVID. Now we have the war in the Ukraine. Now we have to take care of the war. And who is taking care of climate change? So at least the measures which are taken and the money which is spent should be spent in a manner which is trying to catch two birds at the same, or even three birds at the same time. And unfortunately, this is not the case with the Inflation Reduction Act. And the best solution, if I may make a recommendation, change it.
Well, even though Dr. Kim asked the opinions from European side and US side, but I have to say Korean side. Well, when you mention about Korean porous FTA, we emphasize the requirement of the environmental standard of Korean government regulations, but we gave enough exceptions for each company is making 50,000 cars. You don't have to worry about this. So when we introduce these regulations, we give some exceptions. So based on that kind of argument, I think we want to see U.S. government to give some exceptions for electric vehicles manufactured in Korea until the Korea car makers start producing electric vehicles in the United States. there are two aspects. I mean, even this kind of proposal was made by Senator Ralph Warnock of Georgia State last month. I don't know whether this idea will be moving forward or not, but in any case, there are two aspects to support this kind of proposition, because Korea has an FTA with the United States. You cannot be discriminated even though you are FTA member. And also, more importantly, Hyundai Motor Group has committed to invest more than $10 billion to produce electric vehicles in the United States. Now you are penalizing this kind of Korean car makers. So hopefully, this is a little bit out of blue, but we hope the IRA get amended, that the tax credit rules.
See, we agree.
Maybe maybe applies if they want to do something only to EV batteries, not the EV vehicles. In any case, if these suggestions are not accepted, maybe Korean government is considering bringing the case to WTO, or as well as chorus FTA dispute settlement procedures. Before I let Seoul to come here, some people are suggesting, in this situation, everything is not correct, not amended, then Korean car makers may have to provide some kind of price discount to the American consumers who didn't get the subsidies. So they want to compensate the subsidies they didn't get. So it makes a huge complication to Korean car makers who made a strong commitment to invest $10 billion in the United States. So something must be reconsidered. I don't know about that because we have an election coming up in November, all kind of political situation in the United States. We don't have a huge amount of hope, but something must be considered.
Thank you. Indeed, this was the climate of the discussion in Seoul last week. Robert, do you have
Yes.
comments?
So let me set the context for this because I think it helps explain the new era that we will be in. All of us know the sensitivity of some traditional industries with protectionism and politics, the steel industry being the most prominent. But autos is probably a close second. And as Minister Park will know, in Korea, there was often a frustration in the United States that some of the supposed safety rules about lights and other aspects always seem to be designed to keep out US cars. Michael will recall, I think the US tariff on autos is about 2.5%, European is about 10%. This is a sector that is very vulnerable to politics because it's an important industrial sector in all of the economies. Going back to a point that Michael made, that sector is going to be in the midst of a huge change because moving to electronic vehicles is going to change the whole nature of the manufacturing process that used to be for the engines in particular. Much of the rest of the cars may be similar. And so this is going to have a huge effects on jobs wherever cars are produced. I would add to this sort of to Michael's point, I think one has to recognize that the energy transition that we're now in the midst of could have the potential to be as significant to all our economies as the Industrial Revolution. These are huge transformations in the nature of our economies. And if those occur at a time like the present, where you're having more ideas about economic autonomy and protectionism, one has to be watchful of what will be the effects. So let's dig more particularly into the question of the electric vehicles, which are the cause of concern, particularly for Korea. In 2009, the United States passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And the idea was to give tax credits up to $7,500 for any producer of EVs up to a cap of $200,000. So that was an open system. It was a subsidy to encourage consumers to move to EVs. In the area of energy policy, one might have preferred, as opposed to having a subsidy, to actually have some form of carbon taxes, but that was politically unacceptable. Now, the main challenge for Korea was that Kia and Hyundai didn't export until 2021. So they're well below that 200,000 cap. Other companies in the United States, some of the European exporters are actually near the 200,000 cap. Then we go to the Build Back Better proposal that the administration had. And what I want to draw attention is the changes between that proposal and the Inflation Reduction Act. One change was in the Build Back Better, the batteries had to be just from the United States. In the final legislation, it included North America, which recognized the integration of the auto industries with Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Another change was it allowed critical minerals to come from FTA partners. So there, Korea would be included, Japan would not, the EU would not. It removed a union requirement. And that was important because many of the foreign investors in the United States were in states that didn't have the union, didn't have auto unions, and so they would have been excluded. But it also removed the unit cap, and that was good for some companies that were nearing it, but it wasn't good for Hyundai and Kia. It also added a price cap for cars, which was probably a wise policy in my view, so as to limit the benefit for higher income people, and an income cap for buyers. Without debating the particular elements, what I want to draw to your attention is notice how the policy evolves over time. Now, Hyundai was caught because it's building an EV plant in Georgia, but that isn't expected to produce until 2025. Now, on the positive side, from Korea's point of view, at least my understanding, there are significant tax breaks given in Georgia. So it's not surprising you've got a Georgia senator who's sort of willing to make the case for Hyundai's sort of plants. And as I alluded to in my opening comments, the Korean battery companies, LG and SK, will probably do quite well in this system. Ford is developing a relationship with SK. GM is doing one with LG. And we had the ironic situation where those two Korean companies were actually in the midst of litigation, stopping one another until the United States sort of mediated some dispute. Now, the other thing to watch in this area, and frankly, it's unclear from the initial legislation how far this will extend. There is an application of no content from foreign entities of concern. Well, that's clearly signaling China. And at least my understanding is in a lot of the production processes, the raw materials may not come from China, but China has been the assembly and the refiner of these materials. So one issue will be how will this affect the supply chains in the production process. So coming back to at least the Korean situation, the first important message is this is the dawn of a new era of industrial policies in the US, particularly for these sectors. And it'll be important for Korea to engage in the process and try to draw the distinctions that some of you have been drawing. Korea is an FTA partner. Korea is an ally. Now, the law will have to be implemented through regulations by the Treasury Department. I have no idea of the nature of how the Treasury will approach this, but one possibility would be to point to the fact that the Georgia plant is being developed by Hyundai and whether there's some transition rules until it sort of comes up to its level. I'm not suggesting that will happen, but I'm explaining this is the new trade policy world that we're moving into in the United States. The minister also mentioned another possibility. There's no prohibition for Korea selling its EVs in the United States. You're just not getting the benefit of the tax credit. So, of course, one other possibility is you lower the price until you can expand your production in the United States. And frankly, what I just went through with EVs, you're now going to see with semiconductors. semiconductors as well. So in reading the news this morning, I saw that for some of the restrictions on semiconductor production with tools, that I think there's been a year extension for the South Korean production in China. But the question is how long that will last. And that's the big 500-pound gorilla in the room here. In addition to the normal politics of protectionism and the idea that if a country is going to use tax credits, it should go to its companies and its workers. The real bigger challenge, I think, for Korea and to a degree the European Union is going to be as the US puts more technology restrictions, particularly in the semiconductors, in dealing with China, how will this limit the set of activities? Now, I'll just close by saying that there are counter arguments to these types of restrictions. By not being able to sell some semiconductors into China, it's probably going to hurt the profitability and the investment potential of these companies. But I'm trying to point out as an analyst, the Biden administration has taken a very strong and harsh position about China as a technology competitor. And I'm afraid that Korea in particular is going to get squeezed in this. Now, as the minister mentioned, it would certainly make sense for Korea to do the best that it can in terms of multiplying and diversifying its relationships. Both he and I would probably agree that it would be wise for Korea to join the CPTPP, which I think it's a mistake the United States pulled out of. It should try to use every opportunity it can, whether with relations to Southeast Asia, Japan, India, and others, to diversify. So the description that I'm giving you does not make me happy. This is not the direction of economic policy I would have pursued. But for the purposes of a practical discussion, I'm using this as an example to point out the fact that Korean and European partners who should have equities in the United States, not only as investors, but as allies, will have to engage the administration and the Congress on these type of industrial policy details.
Very good, thank you. And actually, I'd like to continue a little bit on this theme. So let's put a little positive on this. What do you see as the major issues underpinning the potential for cooperation? What's the potential for cooperation now between the US, Korea, and the EU? Is there the current situation with the Ukraine? Is it affecting this or not? Please.
Say briefly.
Absolutely.
Well, three parties, in other words, EU, US, Korea, in this kind of particular situation, we can monitor and share information on supply situation of key products and materials, such as energy, food, semiconductor, EV batteries, and critical minerals. They can also address joint countermeasures to deal with supply chain disruptions and secure stable supplies of key strategic products and materials. In these regards, the current Trade and Technology Council, we call TTC, between the United States and EU could be expanded to include Korea and maybe possibly Japan too, for example. Of course, as mentioned, Russia-Ukraine war enhanced the need for this type of cooperation among advanced, like-minded economies. Michael already pointed out, I want to emphasize one more time, I would like to know that the three parties should make joint efforts to revitalize the multilateral trading system of the WTO. I don't know whether US is committed or not, but this is a very important topic to discuss. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Mike?
Well, just a footnote to the discussion we had before. I mean, if I look at my country in Austria, we have a regulation which is in conformity with the European Union. When you buy an electric car, irrespective who is the maker, where is the producing country, what is the battery, you get a discount of about 2,500 euros because it should serve the environment. So if you want to copycat, I probably can provide you with the regulation. And I think that solves the problem. It is an incentive for the buyer, and it takes away all the discrimination which we have. And as we know, gratefulness is not a criteria in politics. So turning to something positive, I think that would be positive, by the way. Let me flag one issue which is on my mind, and the minister referred to it briefly. I think we are risking to move from one dependency to the next dependency. We have experienced a dependency with oil, we have experienced a dependency with gas. Now we are looking into the emerging technologies, and now the name tells everything. We need rare earths and rare metals. And we will need more of them in the fourth industrial revolution, in the new technologies. So what are we doing? Are we preparing for that situation, or are we waiting for the next cartel to tell us what to do and what the price will be? At the same time, one situation is rather similar, with few exceptions like Australia. Most of the countries which are rich in rare metals and earths are not the democratic countries we would wish for. So if we are talking about cooperation among democracies, I think there's a problem. So what would be useful? I think the US, EU, Korea could think about that, because these are highly industrialized countries engaged in the emerging technologies, and we will need that raw material. So we should not wait until we have a problem. We should make contingency planning. I think that is something which I would put actually on the top of the agenda. Another issue which has to go on top of the agenda is all linked to cybersecurity. Cybersecurity needs by definition cooperation. There again, Korea is a very interesting case study, because it is one of the highest, best connected countries in the world, which creates the paradox that you are the most vulnerable to attacks. And what we do see that every moment, basically, the strategic infrastructure is increasing. And I think this is also an issue which we should address rather quickly. I mean, there are two cases of cybersecurity issues. One is more related to geopolitics, using it as a weapon, and then we have a part which is criminal activity. And I think concerning the latter, I would invite Korea to speed up the joining the Budapest Convention, because this is also a role model for cooperation to fight cyber crime. That's not the solution for the geopolitical part, but for the other crime. And I mean, this is close to my heart also, because we are just about to publish a book on cybersecurity policy in the EU and South Korea, from consultation to action. I plead guilty for the title, because I would like to see this transition from consultation to action. So, by the way, if you want to book, take note of it. I think there we already have a sort of good track record with Korea. The General Data Protection Regulation was accepted by Korea. Korea made some adaptations. By the way, this is also a role model, I think, for governance building. When you want to become partner of the General Data Protection Regulation, you don't have to adopt the European model, but you have just to make the necessary changes that the effectiveness of the protection is the same as in Europe. So you don't have to change the Korean system, you just have to adapt. And that was done. And I think creating there as much momentum as possible to have the general data protection is important. for the exchange of data. And I think there we always have an issue with the United States. And I think Korea and the European Union could give a little bit help to our American friends to China's here. Another issue that I stopped, but it comes to my mind because when I was in Seoul, I gave a speech. One of the first speeches on green financing at KIEP, and I think that has taken up now a little bit of speed. The European Union has developed something which is called taxonomy. And this is necessary because everybody is in favor of green financing and green. Okay, but if my green is different from your green, which green is the right green? So we have to agree on that, and taxonomy is an issue, and we need that worldwide. And it is a market-conform mechanism because if you get, for example, all the big pension funds in the world and to invest only in certified green bonds, I mean, then you change very quickly the behavior in a market-conform manner. So these are just a few examples. If you want me to continue, just let me know. But back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Robert, on cooperation. You're muted.
Sorry. Let me just add 5 points to the good points that my colleagues have made. I think in President Kim's opening remarks, he mentioned the digital sector, and Michael's come back to that. If I were U.S. trade representative today, I would probably be focusing my efforts most on the digital trade. Even before the pandemic, you could see the change in its effect on supply chains and business relationships globally, but the pandemic supercharged and accelerated it. Sometimes people think that this issue is just for the technology industry, but it runs the gamut, from industrial processes to airplane engines to agriculture. Anybody who's involved with business these days understands the importance of the data and digital sectors. And frankly, the standards and rules about when transfers are permitted, whether you have to have data localization, software requirements, are still very, very fluid. And I think the challenge here is to find some common rules that allow countries to set their own standards for privacy, as the European Union has done, but also to encourage the exchange of the data because it's critical to future productivity and economies. And so I think for Korea as well, the EU already has this discussion with the United States, but I think it'll be very important for Korea to emphasize this as well. The second point goes back to the topic we discussed with EVs, which is the larger clean energy agenda. I think it would be useful, as Michael and others sort of brought out, to say, if you really want to move towards a clean energy policy or an EV policy, you're mixing your purposes if at the same time you're trying to just promote domestic production. So I think it would be probably useful to look at the full range of clean energy development, whether it's solar panels or whether it's transmission lines or whether it's different types of vehicles, and have a better understanding of how an integrated marketplace, at least among trusted partners, is important to be able to have this transition as efficiently and effectively as possible. Because otherwise, you're going to see the types of actions we've saw through this recent US legislation, where particularly the bigger economies, it's the US, you'll see this in China, and frankly, as Michael knows, there's movements towards strategic autonomy in Europe as well. They'll think they can do it on their own, but they won't be able to do it on their own. But the politics will push them in that direction. The third point is one that I alluded to with semiconductors. We're going to face export controls with China. The question is, how far do we have to choke off all trade with China? Frankly, there are semiconductors and there are semiconductors. There's semiconductors at the high end that have sensitive security uses. There's a lot of other semiconductors that are not at the high end. And I think this is, again, where a important dialogue for the US with its closest allies needs to try to draw lines here and not necessarily reach too far in terms of trying to cut off the economic relations, which from my point of view will also add to acrimony with China. And then at times when you're going to want to have China on your side, whether it's dealing with climate or whether it's pushing Putin on reaching some resolution in Ukraine, you're not going to find China on your side. So that's I think another area. The fourth one also grows out of the Russia attack on Ukraine, and that I think some in the United States and Europe were surprised by the number of abstaining UN votes. Now, they had another vote yesterday. You had a smaller number of abstainers, but one could see that, frankly, many countries in the Middle East, Africa, South Asia, Latin America had other priorities. Their priorities were dealing with the pandemic or debt and interest rates or food and energy prices. And so I think this, I hope, will make both the United States and Europe more attentive to the fact that if you want to bring these countries to your side, you're going to have to deal with some of their concerns. That's this topic, I'm sure, going on as we speak with the World Bank, IMF set of meetings. And this brings us back to the WTO, which some of you have mentioned. And I think one of the point, again, for close partners and friends of the United States, particularly Korea and the EU, it would be useful to bring to the attention the administration that if the administration is basically protectionist on trade, unwilling to have market access, you're going to lose friends that you will want to have in other contexts. And then that leads to the fifth point, the Trade and Technology Council. Michael might have a better sense of this, but when I was in Brussels, maybe now a couple months ago, I got a sense that the US use of that council is primarily focused on export controls with China, as opposed to some other broader industry development issues. I think it would be an excellent idea to draw our Asian partners into it. But again, this is where, as good friends, Europe and Korea, I think, need to press the administration that to, on the one hand, recognize the sensitivities about China, which are very sharp in Washington. The people at GW will be able to explain all this to people if they have any uncertainty. But at the same time, if you push these issues too far and you lose your partners and allies, you're not going to be effective. And you might also raise the larger strategic question, which is at the time that we're in the midst of a strong conflict with Russia, do you really want to also have a confrontation with China, which obviously turns on its head the Kissinger differentiation going back to the 70s. So I know I'm putting a burden on our friends and allies here, and I'm not saying it would be an easy one, because the attitude towards China is very, very strong in Washington. But on the other hand, I think there is a feeling in the administration that to be successful on these topics, one has to do it with allies and partners. And so the voices of allies and partners need to be heard on these topics.
Thank you, Robert. In fact, this is excellent, because the question I wanted to close with is the reaction of smaller countries similar to the reaction of bigger countries. So there is this fallacy. I totally agree with Robert. There is this fallacy that the big countries, the United States, can do it on its own, can actually move forward without consultation and create the rules. And these times, I think, are over. Maybe there was a time like this, but it's coming to an end. We are only very few minutes away from finishing this panel. I would like to ask you three for closing statements.
I have a little bit long closing statement, but I want to shorten this. This is my the key issue of my closing remark is this. Considering all the policy measures happening in the United States, some trade experts, not only in Korea, but also in the United States, are questioning whether U.S. is committed to defend or reform the rules-based multilateral trading system, or simply pursuing for anti-China or America first policy. And as of now, it seems that the latter prevails. Many people agree with that. So naturally, in this case, there are some concerns in Korea that we may lose the justification for supporting the U.S. recent trade policies. I mean, I have to say something else, but this is exactly the key message I want to raise. Conclude.
Very, very worrisome message. Marco?
I would also like to get the answer to your question. I think it's a good question, but if I talk now more as a political scientist professor, then I would say there is a tendency of large countries to be suspicious of international institutions because they think if they can do it bilaterally, they are stronger. And I think this is a fallacy, especially in today's economy. Even if the heydays of globalization may be over for some time, but we have already reached a degree of globalization that we cannot go back overnight, and it would not be in our interest. So the concern which I have is now that with all that reorganization, more resilience, and so on, one has there are legitimate security concerns which I would recognize any time, but it needs very fine-tuned measures in order to make sure to achieve the security goal and avoid that we destroy the international trading system or that we go into blocks. And I think this is one of the dangers that we end up with a Western bloc, a Chinese bloc, I don't know, and somewhere the Russians behind the Chinese. And that would be the end of a rule-based order, because whether we are in competition, whether we have security concerns, and in order to have economic exchanges, we need the rules of the road. And without it, we open the door and we go back to our good old friend Leviathan, and that's not in the interest because we have worked the last 70 years to overcome that. So the unraveling of what is called the liberal international order, I think that's the real danger. But what is also a danger is that people don't understand that we cannot continue as we have. We have to reform. We have to adapt and to develop a concept for that. I think that would also be a task which we could do together with the United States. But the United States has never shown a big interest in trade rules. Why did we have the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade as a provisional measure for 50 years? Because the US Congress did not like the International Trade Organization as in addition to World Bank and the IMF. So with the Clinton administration at the time, it was possible to come up with the WTO, but the laissez-faire was over very quickly. So we have to rekindle love for the WTO. Not an easy task, but let's do it together because we have to manage the system. We have to adapt the system. We cannot stand still. Otherwise, we all lose.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And Robert.
So I'll just make 3 brief points. One, to thank the conveners of this conference, because I think as our discussion has suggested, even in a brief time, you couldn't come across more timely issues. And I think there's a lot of follow-up to be done on each of the categories we mentioned. Second point, part of the follow-up, it will be the devil in the details. And this is where we've introduced this with EVs and batteries and semiconductors. And I think the critical necessity for close partners such as the European Union and Korea to engage the US government on the effects of this in terms of their common interests. But third, I don't want to totally give up on the macro issue. I mean, for example, today, inflation is obviously a pretty topical issue for all our countries. And one of the reasons that people may care about trade policy is that it raises costs and prices. So in some ways, people took this for granted. We've been in a decades-long period where you frankly had a huge expansion of the labor force in the global market economy. You had lower costs, you had highly unusual monetary policies. That is also in a huge period of transition. So I find, for example, when I talk to some US audiences, that the idea that, well, maybe trade protectionism raises costs and hurts your competitiveness and raises prices for consuming families starts to have more resonance along the way. So I do think that there's lots of moving parts. We've got polycrises going on here, from inflation to Russian invasion to the China-US tension to the energy transition. And I think one of the skills for a combination of policymakers and scholars together is, how do you integrate those so as not to lose the benefits of the international system that we created over the course of 70 years?
Thank you. So I think the closing statement here is we need more cooperation. We need to keep talking, to keep listening to each other. That's what
We should bring Bright Robert into government. What do you think about that?
I want to thank our panelists. They did a great job. Let's give them a
Thank you, Nick. Let's move on to the next session on the cooperation on economic security, technology, climate change, and energy and digital trade. To be moderated by Mary Lovely, Anthony Solomon, Senior Fellow at Peterson Institute for International Economics. So the speakers for the next session, please have a seat.
Hello. Hi. I'm Q. Good to see you. Yeah, Q is fine. Yeah, Michigan State. Yeah. Oh, you're favorite. Okay. Great. Oh, yeah, good to see you.
Yeah, okay. In our indent in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're ready to start. We're coming right from a very fascinating panel that tackled so many of the issues that we're going to continue to speak about in this new panel. The panel session, or the session title, is called Cooperation on Economic Security, Technology, Climate Change, Energy, and Digital Trade. That is a lot for 1 hour. Fortunately, we have experts in each of these issues, and I think we will just whet the appetite of all of you to refer back to their many publications. So, panelist to my right, Jahoko Goto. She is Director of Geoeconomics at Indo-Pacific Enterprise and Deputy Director for the Asia Program at the Wilson Center. She specializes in trade relations and economic issues across the Indo-Pacific and is also focused on the political developments in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. So Pleased to make your acquaintance. We have many things in common. Next is Dr. Lee Kyu. He is the head of the New Strategy team at the Korea Institute of International Economic Policy. He's also the co-editor of the Journal of APAC Studies and co-editor and advisor to the monthly trade magazine for the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy. Next is Dr. Jin Young Moon. He's the head of the Global Cooperation Strategy team at the Korean Institute of International Economic Policy. He's also a research fellow with KIEP, and prior to joining KIEP, he worked for NH Investment and Future Corp. Jane Nakano is a senior fellow in the Energy, Security, and Climate Change program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Her research interests include U.S. energy policy, global market and policy developments concerning natural gas, nuclear energy, and critical minerals, and also energy security and climate issues in the Asia Pacific region. We can imagine that her phone's been ringing a lot. Finally, to my left, we have Ramon Pacheco Pardo. He is KF-VUB Korea Chair at the Center for Security, Diplomacy, and Strategy, the Brussels School of Governance. Professor Pardo is also Professor of International Relations at King's College London. He's an adjunct fellow with the Korea Chair at CSIS. He's a non-resident fellow with Shigong Institute and a committee member at CSCAP EU. Welcome to all of you. There's so much to discuss. I'd like to open up the floor first with a question for Shihoko. One of the concepts that's increasingly discussed is the idea of economic security. In fact, national security has become synonymous with economic security. How do you view economic security, and what are the implications of the concept for the trilateral cooperation between the US, Korea, and the EU? Now, that's a small question.
Quite frankly, we could spend like a whole forum on what exactly economic security means, etc. But first of all, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this very august panel. It's really a great pleasure and honor to be here, and it's really great that we're actually here in person as well. On economic security, it used to be that we talk about securing a path to growth. So that is not to say that there aren't risks to the global economy. The previous panel touched upon the fact that we still have macroeconomic challenges, everything from inflation to the turmoil in the financial markets, to real estate concerns, to issues about employment. But that's not what we mean with the economic security within the last few years. We are really, I'm not talking about measuring living standards and the like. It's really to find the overlap or the intersection between security and economic interess, which are increasingly no longer these separate spheres. And we are seeing this great overlap. And so the coordination of those interests. And I would say that there is a greater focus on the security aspect of this at the moment, especially in the United States, rather than the economic side. Yesterday, the United States released its much long-awaited national security strategy, and it identified some obvious issues that we are aware of. Russia and China remain threats to the United States. They threaten global stability, and they also are jeopardizing US values. But what is interesting about this strategy paper is that it really opened up talking about investing in competitiveness and investing in industrial and innovation strategy. It's a de facto industrial policy, and we've already talked about that in the previous panel. But it really highlights the fact that this the introduction of the CHIPS Act, Chips and Science Act by the United States, and the companion piece about export restrictions to bolster the US semiconductor manufacturing base. And the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really supposed to bring down costs of drug prices and also pave a way forward for US energy security, efforts to ensure supply chain reassessments. These have all they're not seen just as an economic move forward, but also a necessity to ensure the United States' own very survival moving forward. And so you have the non-traditional agencies like the Department of Defense really getting involved in it. Why is that? So there are a number of reasons. One is, of course, to meet the China challenge. Mariana, you can go on about this at great length and with great authority. But we are no longer underestimating the ability of China not just to catch up, but to actually take over and take the lead in the global economy. The Chinese economic threat is something that actually brings together a very divided US Congress. And there is great recognition that has bipartisan support that the United States cannot remain ahead without a significant overhaul and reinvestment in its strategic economic efforts, which require this national security strategy to be unveiled. Another concern is, of course, about economic coercion and the weaponization, essentially, of the global economy. There is, of course, a backlash against unbridled globalization for a number of years, even over the last couple of decades. But we are aware, too, that with the rise of China, with the domination of Russia and the energy sphere, that economic coercion is a great threat that requires intervention that goes beyond what free markets can actually provide. And then there is also the rise of economic statecraft, and that goes on both sides. So we talk about economic coercion by both China and the United States, but we are also seeing the rise of economic statecraft on the part of the United States and its allies and partners as well. A very good case in point of this is the situation in Ukraine. So one of the first steps that came together was to bring the United States, NATO, and its allies to come together to take to take strong economic action towards Russia, essentially declaring an economic war against Moscow. That there has been a great deal of unity on that front, but at the same time as the war in Ukraine persists, we also see this the limitations also of such unity and the effectiveness of economic warfare as well. So where are the opportunities for cooperation? It is clear that we do share many countries, and especially the United States, South Korea, the European Union share same concerns. But we also have to bear in mind that there are varying degrees of concerns, especially when it comes to dealing with the China threat. But in a broader perspective, there is unity in understanding that collective pushback against Chinese economic coercion would be more effective than acting alone. There is also recognition that there is a need to protect critical technologies and that supply chains as they currently stand are incredibly vulnerable and can be weaponized by authoritarian regimes. Is there a possibility for an economic security alliance? For instance, NATO has its Article 5 of the collective defense, so there is collective action against those that attack one EU member country will trigger a collective response to spirit. Can we have that kind of collective economic mechanism in Asia together with the United States and the European Union? It is worth exploring. This is not necessarily a mainstream issue, but it does on issues that are not particularly critical. For instance, if China is boycotting Lotte as a response to THAAD deployment in South Korea, is there an ability for collective action to actually respond to that kind of threat? So this is not necessarily about the critical technologies, but to address some of the immediate economic attacks that a ally or partner nation could be facing. It is clear that much of the concerns that we have at the moment regarding economic security is based on technology and protecting the strategic assets that come with technology development. But I do want to end on a high note and say that ultimately this is not actually a digital issue, but it's an analog issue. It's an analog issue because it is about ensuring and developing trust amongst the countries. And without trust, we really cannot talk about how to deal with some of the nearshoring, reshoring industrial policies that countries, including the United States, are pursuing at the moment.
Thank you very much for taking us through the issues, talking about some of the actions that have already been taken, and then really highlighting a number of opportunities for cooperation. It's a great way to set up the panel. Ramon, I'd like to turn to you now in Europe. Europe's clearly dealing with the fallout of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So how is the idea of economic security in Europe being affected by this? And also, maybe you could talk a little bit about whether the war has pushed the EU closer to thinking about the threats from China, as does the United States.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, both are excellent questions, actually. When it comes to economic security, it has to be said that, yes, in Europe, obviously, the discussion about energy is crucial. We don't know how we're going to go through the winter, if we're going to be able to go, for example, without power cuts, right? So it's something that affects everybody's lives. And what is interesting is that I think this builds on previous fears that they were in Europe, related to technology. The idea that technologically, maybe other countries, the US, but of course, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, for example, maybe more advanced in certain technologies, for example, semiconductors, of course, but others as well, electric batteries, are going to be able to compete with these companies. Never mind China, we're talking here about partner countries, countries for which we have good relations, common values. So even with these countries which relations are good, that was already this year. Which takes me to the very valid point that you raised about changing perceptions of China in Europe. I would say that perceptions were changing already before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There was this perception in Europe that China had changed, that it wasn't playing by the rules, and that not only wasn't playing by the rules, but it was using economic coercion. And we had examples in Europe, of course, Lithuania, Sweden as well. We have cases of Korea, Australia, so partner countries as well. So this idea that because China had changed its behavior, Europe had to change its behavior towards China. For example, you saw the introduction of investment screening mechanisms clearly targeting Chinese investment, and that was quite obvious if you could follow the political debate. But at the same time, compared to the US, I would say that there were divisions about how to deal with China. Right? So some countries felt that it was still worth to engage. And we saw, for example, the investment treaty that the EU signed with China that then hasn't been ratified for political reasons. And I don't think it's anywhere close to being ratified now because of the sanctions on European members of parliament, MEPs from China. But that signaled that there were politicians and member states, European countries, that were willing to still engage with China economically in a way that maybe the US had started to move on. And then along came Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think if you ask in Brussels, in most European capitals, the perception is that China has sided with Russia. We can debate whether this is the case or not, but if you talk to policymakers in Europe, that's the perception, that's the view, and this is informing policy towards China. This has led to the European Union, the European countries, France, Germany, the UK individually as well, trying to forge stronger relations with the US, but also with Asian partners on security issues, definitely, but also on economic matters as well. The number of European delegations traveling to Seoul, to Tokyo, you also have delegations going to Taipei now as well, for example. And there is, of course, the political security component, but there's also the very strong economic component. How do we strengthen economic relations with these countries for our own economic security. But on the other hand, because of the rapprochement between the US and these East Asian countries, thinking, for example, about the C4 between Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and the US, there is this perception in Europe, again, going back to the previous year that I mentioned, that technologically we might not be at the same level as these other partners, that we might be left behind. And it was fairly interesting. I happened to be in Korea when the C4 was announced, and meeting with European envoys, not talking about the EU here, I'm talking about European envoys, different European countries. In Seoul, they were knocking on the door of Motie, the trade ministry, the foreign ministry, saying, well, what is going on here? Why are, for example, Dutch companies, British companies that are also involved in the production process of chips, why are not being invited to the table? And now there's this push in Europe, I think in two directions. One of them to strengthen the capabilities of the European Union per se, their own independent economic capabilities, especially in the area of tech, to diversify the sources of energy imports, clearly away from Russia, for very obvious reasons. But on the other hand, that you see, on this on the one hand, right, you see this push for more autonomy, strengthening domestic capabilities. On the other hand, reinforcing the links with other countries, for example, through FTAs, through consultations with other countries, and something as simple as reminding other countries that Europe wants to work together with them, right? But sometimes it has to be said, right, that we're willing to cooperate with you. So I think that's where we are going. So the simple answer to your question would be economic security is crucial to Europe, and it is being central to political discussions in Europe. And the longer answer is what I just explained, right? How to deal with the economic insecurities that we feel in Europe.
Thank you so much, Ramon, for that. I think it's interesting that you highlighted the fact that the Korea-US relationship is different than the Korea-EU relationship. And of course, that goes back to sort of tensions between the EU and US. And also that these fora are different, that the US is speaking to these countries at different venues. And I want to come back to that at the end to think about how we can bring that circle around. You also focus on inter-union competition and the idea that not every country shares the same interests. And in fact, in some spheres, we're competitors. And that Europe has taken the step to try to forge stronger relationships with its Asian partners directly. It seems that may have been helped a little bit by recent developments in the energy market. And Jane, I'd like to turn to you now. Stick with the idea of economic security, but move a bit more specifically to energy. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, along with US and EU sanctions, have had a significant impact on energy markets, especially in the EU. Korea has helped Europe deal with its energy crunch by allowing the diversion of some of its LNG imports to the EU. I'd be interested in your thoughts on what the war means for energy cooperation in the short to medium run, and also what are the longer term prospects for sustaining this cooperation in the energy sphere and maybe having positive spillovers to other issues in economic security. I know that's a lot.
Thank you so much for a great question, Mary. And then also thanks to the conveners of this excellent timely conference. It's really my pleasure and honor to be here. So I think we've seen significant gap between the price of natural gas, LNG in Europe and Asia, and that is really putting a lot of strain on European nations. And I think before we get to more cooperation and sustained energy peace, I think things like sharing LNG supply, I think it's very much short-lived in that whenever there is a higher price in certain markets, I think that's where the supplies of crude oil or LNG tend to flow. And as we go into the wintertime, we will likely to see more competition among markets, among buyers. And so those things are probably much more sort of temporary measures. And that certainly then, points us to the way, with more creative ways to come up with more sustained cooperation. What we are seeing in Europe is really unprecedented level of crisis, both in terms of energy, but then really the energy, not just the energy market crisis, but then energy economic security. But what's been remarkable is the level of commitment that the EU has shown in trying to proceed with its decarbonization commitments. The idea isn't really all of a sudden say, okay, well, it's somewhat, there are some individual country approaches that seem to point to, more dependence on fossil fuels. But, my take is that fossil fuels have things to contribute, economic security or energy security, but we still have to really address the negative attributes of fossil fuels. So it's not that fossil fuels themselves that really are evil, if you will. But anyways, I think the commitments we've seen through documents like the Repower EU have shown us that there's no U-turn. And I think Europe's commitment to shift away from Russia and particularly Russian fossil fuels really has amplified the fact that these non-fossil fuel energy sources and technologies have not just decarbonization or climate benefits, but they also have energy security benefits. And in that case, in that sense, I think it's very important message that Europe is sending to the rest of the world. And when it comes to the cooperation piece, I think we have this shared challenge to really make supply chains more robust, not just the crude oil, refined oil products and natural gas, but the clean energy technologies and components, and also including component mineral supply chains. And of course, that will probably get us to talking a little more about the recent US laws, but let me just save that for probably later, maybe Q&A. But I think when it comes to the challenge of making our supply chains more robust and resilient, I want to emphasize that the idea in my mind is not to really come up to push China out of the equation, to be honest with you. I think we all have shared interest in making the supply chains, global supply chains, more robust, because the disruptions to supply chains could come from pandemic as well as geopolitical tensions. So the idea is to make it more robust and resilient, not necessarily to have completely parallel supply chains that could really geopoliticize energy. So in that sense, I think research and innovation is a crucial space where the United States, South Korea, and the EU have a lot to cooperate. That could include coming up with substitutes for some of these minerals, also advancing technologies that do rely on, that wouldn't rely on single sources or source countries. In that case, often it's China, but it doesn't have to be China. We rely quite a bit on some of the Russian technologies or supplies, fuels, when it comes to nuclear or even like nickels for EV batteries. The other important, and let me also mention what's happening in Europe vis-a-vis EV battery recycling is quite exciting. I think we need to be mindful of the impact that the clean energy technologies could have on ecosystem. So it's really important for the US, South Korea, and others to see this, what EU is experimenting in that space is and as an important lesson. So the recent EU legislation is to require a certain percentage of minerals to be the second life, the recovered or recycled minerals. That's another area where we might see more sustained cooperation. And last but not least, I think standardization is a very understated, underappreciated area where we really should be cooperating more. When it comes to clean energy technologies, but especially I think when it comes to minerals, there are a lot of in many ways we haven't. I guess our collective economies haven't been as strategic about how we want to proceed setting standards on defining purity of certain minerals like lithium and how to test them and how to measure how fit they are for recovery standards. For example, one case that comes to my mind where we have been falling short on that, the cooperation potential is at the International Standardization Organization. I think China has become quite active in some of the minerals working groups where their standards, their view is starting to be quite dominant, and it's not to say that that's bad. It's just that I think Washington, Brussels, and Seoul also need to have more long-term strategic view on what this may mean for our industrial partners, not just government policymakers, but then also companies that want to stay competitive in this sphere. So let me just end there and look forward to further questions later.
Thank you so much, Jane, for really discussing Europe's commitment to clean energy and how the war has highlighted the security benefits of the energy transition. I think it's something we've touched upon many times in the past. We all know that there have been many commenters who questioned German reliance, for example, on Russian energy sources. But now I think we're taking a new look at the security aspects. You also highlighted some things which I think are underappreciated, especially in the US, where we focus mostly on industrial policy, particularly related to the automobile industry and tech competition with China. I think too, with the neglect of important things like R&D and how it can be a globally beneficial spillover. Recycling seems like something your nanny wants to talk about, but something that's vitally important. And of course, standardization, which most people just like, what? But of course, it's vitally important, not only in this area, but in developing the future of digital technologies. So that was really a very broad comment. I'd like to turn to you, Jin-Yoon, now. The Moon Jae-in administration took steps in the second half of its term to address climate change, specifically pledging that Korea would become carbon neutral by 2050. Can you tell us a little bit about the energy policies of the Yoon administration? What do they look like? And where do you see as the most promising aspect for cooperation between Korea, the EU, and the US? Also, if you could, you might talk a little bit about how we have seen EU and US cooperation on things like green steel. But how can South Korea become an equal partner in those discussions? So really, how can we establish a broader framework for these very important coordination issues in the energy transition?
Morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to discuss lots of kind of challenging issue. I'm very happy to answer that question. Actually, I'm not the energy guy. Since I joined KIEP, I have been involved in the climate change issue, but the energy issue and then climate change issues are highly related. So we need to think over together. Now, energy security is more big challenge for us. So last May, the Presidential Transition Committee announced 110 national agenda of new administration. And then they have two kind of commitment for the energy and environment issue. One is the innovative growth with the advanced economy. And another one is the climate and environment policy direction for sustainable future. The new government wants to address energy security and create new energy industry and market with several measures. The first one is the energy mix need to be adjusted to consider balance between renewable energy and the nuclear power. And second one is the enhancing stability of energy supply chain by securing supply of critical mineral and diversifying energy import control. And third is creation of a new energy industry, including wind, solar, and hydrogen sector, and demand management by combining technologies such as AI, Internet of Things, and big data. Former government announced the hydrogen economy roadmap in 2019, and US government wants to supply hydrogen industry with the production and supply of clean hydrogen. Considering recent energy crisis in Europe, nuclear has an important role as a stable resource to access the transition to clean carbon neutrality. Korean Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy released a draft of 10 stage plan for electric power supply on last summer. And the plan predicts how supply and demand for the next 15 years. The core part of the plan reverses the preceding government's plan by raising the proportion of nuclear power generation from 23.9% to 32.8% by 2030, while lowering the share of renewable energy-based power generation from roughly 30% to 21%. That's a big change. As new administration pledged to rebuild the nuclear power industry and support its expansion overseas, cooperation in the nuclear industry is the most promising area for cooperation. During the presidential campaign, the president had pledged to resume construction of 2 domestic nuclear reactors and aims to export 10 nuclear reactors by 2030. When President Biden and Yoon met Seoul last May, their joint statement recognized the importance of nuclear energy as an integral part of enhancing global energy security. They committed to greater nuclear energy collaboration by jointly using export promotion and capacity building, and more resilient nuclear supply chain. Actually, in order to achieve European Green Deal and induce private investment, as Mitchell noted, the EU taxonomy aims to guide private investment by providing list of what is the environmentally sustainable economic activity. European Commission present a taxonomy complementary climate delegated act last February, and then the act set out the technical screening criteria for certain gas and nuclear activities to be added as transitional activities. The European Parliament did not object the Commission's taxonomy delegated act last summer. Therefore, I think the trilateral cooperation will be needed to enhance the investment and R&D of transition resources. And then another question is, many mentioned is, maybe I can talk about the later, but I think the European Green Deal has lots of kind of the aim, and one of them is CBA, and then Korea is very, how can I say, you watch it seriously, and we know that there are 2-step kind of the CBA, and then also the kind of negotiation between US and EU for the kind of the, how can they see the intensity of carbon, and how we can measure, what will be the MRV. That's another challenging issue. I think I can say it later, but I think the standard and the rule, we need to be collaborating together. Yeah,
Thank you so much for very briefly giving us an overview of what's happening in the Yoon administration in the area of addressing climate change and energy. I'm particularly interested in your emphasis on nuclear power. And it brings me back to what Shahoko said about the importance of trust, because this is an area where national citizens are concerned about the safety of nuclear power. It's certainly in the EU and even in the US. And so trust is highly important as we move forward. I'd like to turn now to Q. Yes, you're coming. Your time has come. We have a lot of topics on this panel, but I want to move to digital trade. And here again, we have an important issue in terms of trust. Digital trade is expanding quickly, and yet national rules haven't really kept up with the need for interoperability and other issues. The EU has GDP, and they're looking into regulating other areas in the digital space. Korea has been taking steps to regulate digital trade with its app payments. The US, we keep talking about it. I'm not sure what my iPhone is doing at this very minute in my purse. But with the US, EU, and Korea seemingly having areas of divergence on digital trade, but everyone telling us this is the fastest growing area of trade. It's potentially a boom for workers being involved, service sector workers being more involved in getting more of the benefits of globalization. It's kind of viewed as one bright spot of globalization. What do you see as options for cooperation among the three regions we're talking about today?
Wow. Okay, I'm Q from KIEP. And first of all, I'm trade economist. I thought I finished my homework during my 13-hour flight, but somehow the question is kind of expanded wider than I don't know how to cope with this difficult situation, but let me try. I'd like to respond that data governance is the most important area for cooperation among the US and EU and Korea, and competition is the second. My response is based on EPA, not digital partnership agreement. In this case, digital policy alert database. Since January 2020, DPA has been tracking policy and regulatory changes affecting cross-border digital commerce, digital trade, electronic commerce, whatever you say. And the primary focus countries are EU, G20 countries, plus Switzerland. Now I have found 3 facts from the database. First one, I bring several numbers. The first one is between January 1st in 2020 and October 9th in 2022, the day before yesterday, and I looked up, then between that 2 periods, the European and G20 governments took 3,801 legal and regulatory steps in digital sectors. Huge number. And second, during the same time period, that 3,801 significant events resulted in 2,161 policy or regulatory changes. Okay. The last one is directly related to my answer. Data governance, online content moderation, and competition law enforcement are 3 of the most active areas of the state intervention. I realized that 2 of the 3 areas are important to the US, the EU, and Korea. And this refers to data governance and competition, not online content moderation. Now let's look at one by one. Data governance is the G20 economy's most active area of the state intervention. It covers, like it already mentioned in the first session, like data protection regulation, by the way, GDPR in the EU, the cross-border data transfers, and the cybersecurity regulation already mentioned in the first session, and probably Michael said that. And about 58% of the 1,567 steps have already resulted in state action in data governance. Huge number again. And policy or regulatory changes in data governance have been detected in the US, in the EU, and Korea. That's the first thing. So we should look at the data governance prior. The second one, the online content moderation, that's the second most active area of the state intervention. 545, that's the number. And then actually 287 actions can be found, but except Korea, there's no number for Korea, okay? Eliminate. The last one is competition law enforcement. That's the third most active area of state intervention. Access to app stores and in-app payment systems, combining user data across services and platform operators and favoring themselves over the business users have been the focus of competition, legislation, and enforcement. The 495 legal and regulatory steps advanced, 252 policy or regulatory changes. Many changes were detected in the EU, including the Digital Market Act and the Digital Services Act. 53 changes can be found in the US, 11 in Korea. In-app payments, as mentioned by our moderator, many are in Korea, the in-app payment system, that law is currently being considered. So let's move on to the question again. So Mary mentioned that the regulatory models appear to be diverging, right? I want to say, we can say that regulatory models in the US, the EU, and Korea are actually diverging, I guess. In other words, we can phrase it like this: uncoordinated state action in the digital domain continues. We can see that from the statistics and from the database. Uncoordinated digital regulations, as we know, can lead to trade conflicts, right? Or tensions, not only on the topics of in-app payments, but also on the issues ranging from data governance to competition. So this is my last comment. Regulatory heterogeneity creates regulatory uncertainty. In economics, uncertainty equals to cost, and increases the risk of data fragmentation. Unfair competition would be detrimental to the global digital ecosystem. Policymakers and regulators in the three countries, I mean the US, the EU, and Korea, need to strengthen policy and regulatory cooperation in these two. What it is, that's data governance and competition. The prior is data governance, and we have to, I mean, at least the three countries, including Korea, have to look at the competition law enforcement. That's the second thing. I'll stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Q. And I can tell you're an economist. I love the numbers, but also you did a good job on your homework and responding to my question. Wow, we have discussed a lot and time is running short. So I'd like to give each person just 2 minutes to respond to kind of an off-the-cuff question. And I know you're all nimble on your feet. In the last session, Robert Zoellick emphasized the need to reach out beyond the trilateral grouping to partners and potential partners in South Asia, Africa, Latin America. What forms do you think such discussions could such discussions take place, or how should they be incorporated into thinking about the trilateral relationship? All of the issues we touched on: supply resilience, energy transition, digital trade, solving the climate, the decarbonization, all require much wider cooperation with other countries. In fact, if we look at not just carbon emissions, we know who the top carbon emitters are, but we look at who's increasing the fastest, it's outside of the normal trio that we're talking about. So how do we reach out to these partners outside while trying to strengthen the trilateral? So I know that's a lot. I'll go quickly. Let me start with you, Jin-Moon. Just go right down the table. 2 minutes.
Actually, when I involved the climate negotiation, especially in finance, so everybody talk about the finance, the importance, because the developed country and developing country has a different objective. So developing country wants kind of the support from developed country, and then developed country also call for the action together. That's why we have Paris Agreement. But to involve the multilateral cooperation and all the cooperation globally, we need to think of how we can solve the climate change issue together. Then we need some kind of incentive or support for the mitigation or adaptation. And also we have to think about how we can act together. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the EU and US is talking about lots of kind of the standard issue, especially EU is doing a lot. So EU has the due diligence, kind of ESG, and then disclosure kind of requirement for corporate sustainable finance. And also they talk about the CBAM. All of the related with kind of the trade issue or the investment issue. So we can think of carefully, and then we need to talk together, work together to solve the basically problem of the climate change issue and energy issue together. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jin-Moon. Very important issue. So we'll go over to you.
Yeah, so there's been a proliferation of new partnerships and ways to work together on common themes. I think we talked about trade both in this panel and the panel before, but I was particularly struck by the fact no one mentioned HIPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that the United States launched. The motivation for that are numerous. We can talk about the downside of it as well. But it is an effort really to reach out to unlikely or partners and to really kind of ensure that there are ways to group countries that are swayable or already firmly committed into the US sphere. So you see in IPEF in Southeast Asia, and let us not forget the Pacific island of Fiji that has entered as well. And we've seen the emergence of AUKUS, we've seen the Quad to really take on new responsibilities and the like. The challenge is that there are too many, and there are various agencies that are involved in all of these and other efforts. There needs to be better coordination, both within countries, so that there is and we talk about standardization and interoperability, so that we can actually move forward and it doesn't simply end up in rhetoric. This current US administration has really not shied away from talking about working together with partners. There hasn't been a lot to show for it. There are specific deliverables that really need to be met on supply chain resilience, on climate sustainability and the like. But I do think some of the more immediate concerns about standardization and the harmonization of rules, especially if we're talking, for instance, about the Chip 4 Alliance and the semiconductor front, which is United States, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. There is this opportunity to really focus on some of the standardization of what should not be exported to China, yes, but what can be exported to China as well. And I think Taiwan is a good role model in kind of meeting that balance of having this cooperation and competition with China. So that's a very long-winded answer to say there's a lot going on, but there's not a lot of progress.
Great, thank you so much. Ramon?
I think it depends on the issue, right? When it comes to climate change, multilateralism seems to be still holding, thankfully. So that won't work for all areas clearly, but for some areas it might. Something that I find interesting is that when you're talking in Europe about the upcoming G20 summit, there is a relief that it's happening in Indonesia, that is not happening in a Western country because it's more of a neutral venue. And there is discussion, could this actually serve, because we should remember, we had the pandemic, so we didn't have these face-to-face meetings between leaders. So there's this hope that somehow could this actually help to reignite cooperation in certain areas. Obviously, there were many problems with especially Putin goes there. It would be very difficult for Europe, I would imagine, for the US to deal with this. But could in some areas, maybe energy security, for example, tech, could this be a forum to discuss at least these issue areas? But I should also say that my perception, discussing this with European policymakers, and last week we had a very good Spain-Japan dialogue actually in Kyoto, is that Japan, Korea, of course, Europe have given up in many areas on this idea that could be multilateral cooperation or even unilateral cooperation. There is mistrust towards certain countries, for example, increasing mistrust towards India because of its position when it comes to Russia. Can it actually really be trusted? So I think we see this move towards having more cooperation between so-called like-minded partners, which I agree with Jacopo, we should reach out beyond them. But I don't see political will in many areas to actually do this. I think it depends on the issue area, but in some of them it might be difficult to reach out to the countries you would really need to have at the discussion table.
Okay, wow. Jane?
I do agree with Shihoko. I think there's a bit of proliferation of all these different fora. But then I also agree with Ramon that I think it's somewhat energy, well, even within the energy universe, it's somewhat energy technology or fuel specific. So things like the hydrogen ministerial could be a very good place for both the public and private sector stakeholders to start talking about what more could be done about, looking at the emissions, better understanding emissions profile to make sure that hydrogen application really helps the climate, goals. And, of course, EU has robust, vision, and then of course Korea is very much interested in hydrogen being the, important, component. And of course, the US has massive funding to become a major producer as well as consumer of hydrogen. But anyways, it depends, critical minerals has its own sort of, set of challenges, and also stakeholders, government, partners. So I'm sorry, I wish I had a good answer, like a single platform. But for now, I think we just have to be mindful that we don't end up coming up with too many vehicles and then really stress the amount of bureaucrats and experts that are available to be able to implement. So thanks.
Q, you have the last word.
Last word, okay. Yeah. I didn't finish my homework, then you unburden my okay. Probably I want to go back to the last comment in the first session. Nicholas mentioned that we have to cooperate, that we have to keep talking. I feel like we know the answer with different emphasis, I guess. The Shihoko mentioned the collective actions, and Jane and Shihoko again in a different context, but the standards and the regulation, the governance, and so on. This is very important. And then common aim, and then find out the common or very similar approaches in terms of policy. And that kind of thing is generally the answer. In the detailed part, I want to say the standards and technology governance is extremely important in this world, I guess. In particular, connecting to the topics in this session one, we talked about the economics, of course, the economic security, of course, the energy, digital, and so on. Very complex. We don't know what's going to happen. The US and China and the EU and everything. So we have to think about rule-based in the system of the digital ecosystem or digital space and so on. Now, we can experiment with a lot of stuff, export control, sanction, investment screening, but I really want to emphasize standards and the technology and governance in order to expect the the situation in order to drag or take China into the rule-based system than rule, standards, governance. That's the priority thing that we have to pursue with the three of us. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to thank our panelists who obviously could have said so much on each of these topics. Thank you to Jinyu Moon, to Shihoko Goto, to Ramon Pardo, Jane Nakano, and Q Lee. Thank you all for being here and for imparting your wisdom to us today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mary. So this concludes today's conference. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.